For the first presentation, may I call upon Dr. Sangay Lachenpa from Sikkim University, Sikkim. His title is China's Development Model in Tibet, Positioning Shifts in the Strategy.
Hello. It's working. Thank you. Hearty good morning to all. First of all, I would like to thank the chair as well as the organizing committee. Apparently, I'll be starting the session for the day. I take that with, so to say, great pressure. And also, I would like to wish each one of you a good day ahead. The topic I'm going to talk about today is what I understand as China's development model in Tibet, positioning shifts in its strategy. So the understanding, the premise or the understanding of my paper flows from the larger, what I understand as, the larger contradictions, or what I understand as a conflict, contestation, especially to do with the larger history of China per se, and at the same time, what I understand as, China's occupation of Tibet, so to say. So in that sense, I think there are lots of, other complexities at play, so to say. So in that sense, the establishment of China's or to understand as Chinese Communist Party control over Tibet, primarily following, say, 1950s, or with the signing of 17-point agreement, basically it did not, lead to the complete control over Tibet. So today we still see the Chinese sovereignty being over Tibet being contested. There's conflict, but again, I'm using sovereignty here in a loose term, so to say. So I can also connote the larger understanding of legitimization. So it is within this connotation that, even today we see there are lots of pressure being forwarded against the larger Chinese hold over Tibet. So it is within those connotations that we see today, Beijing has taken a very, so to say, a careful approach, whether be it at the international forum or at the domestic level, so to say. So it is within this connotation that we see that they have a twin objective. Of course, one is silencing the critic, but at the same time, gaining the legitimacy for a longer run, so to say. So I think here we see, so to say, primarily, of course, again, this is not, so to say, a highly demarcated line. Primarily three strategies. So first, initial years, say 1950s, we see China, trying to establish control over the region. So that is where we see, PLA soldiers entering into Tibet. So that is what the China says as liberating Tibet. The next step was what we understand as a legal connotation. So that was done through the signing of the 17-point agreement. The third aspect, what I try to look at is the accommodating the differences between the Tibet and rest of China. So this was primarily done through what we can connote it as performance, quote and unquote, performance legitimacy. That is, done truly through the development paradigm, trying to, improve the Tibet's economy. So basically the third aspect we see primarily from 1980s onwards with the reapproachment policy of China in Tibet. The fourth aspect, which I'm also going to deal is with the, I won't say new, but which has made, quite a news for now, the education model in Tibet. So it is within this background that I'll try to, delineate my paper primarily on these lines. So before I go to the larger development aspect, I just have one slide. So that is what I call it as polemics of Tibetan history, or say contention, divergences in how the history of Tibet is looked at. So that is, I think yesterday also we had a panel on that, so there has been lots of discussion. So the idea is that, of course, the Communist Party way of looking at China is, or Tibet history is very different from how the CTA or the pro-independence Tibetans looked at it. So in that sense, that's where I understand there is lots of divergences, contestations, and primarily because of this, that is where we see the second aspect of development, or what I understand as performance-based legitimacy. So the understanding is that, with the, say, 1960s cultural revolution and then collectivization, it basically was a big problem for Tibetans. Of course, for Chinese as well, but for Tibetan it was. So the new development or understanding is, or what I can see is, as it came around 1980s with the reapproachment policy, which was led by Hu Yobang, the then party secretary for TTAR. So it came with what we understand as Tibet Work Forum meetings. So the first forum was held in 1980. So basically this work forum, I think, is still continuing today. So primarily, many of the strategies for development policies has been highly, mostly been highlighted through the Tibet Work Forum. So initial, I'll just try to wrap up. The initial program, so Work Forum basically, it delineated on what I understand decollectivization. So since there was reapproachment, in a sense, trying to build the bridge between Tibet and Chinese, so there was lots of, these in the background as well. So of course, it improved the economic aspect, and there were lots of, so to say, liberal space also within the background. The second work forum tried to, look at or understand the basic situation of Tibet. So basically, there was now more proactive role to understand what was basically, keeping Tibetan background. The reapproachment policy, it ended with the martial law, 1970s, and again there were lots of debates within the Chinese ruling elite class also, in the sense, some were blaming the liberal policies in Tibet for the unrest. The martial law, in a sense, also highlighted a rise in Tibetan nationalism per se, so to say also. Similarly, third National Work Forum, it delineated on stability and development, and then there were lots of, say for example, little bit divergences vis-a-vis from 1980s. So in a sense, now they were trying to blame His Holiness. Similarly, 5-year plan, under the 10th 5-year plan of China, weak infrastructure was, so to say, pointed out as the main factor restricting economic progress in China. So similarly, that's where we see, lots of rise in construction of infrastructure in Tibet Autonomous Region. So that's where, I have a graph. The yellow graph shows of course, it's still 2017, but still I think, the graph stands similarly rise as of today. 11th 5-year plan, that's where we have, they try to delineate on what you understand as people first. So basically now you're trying to look at trickle-down effect model or strategy in Tibet, so to say. That is where under, people first or air and weapon approach to development, we had like 101 aid programs wherein, Chinese cities, companies were not asked but rather encouraged to invest in Tibet Autonomous Region. The fifth forum, again, came at backdrop of 2008 demonstration. And fifth forum, interestingly, it also now implemented the common policies in area outside Tibetan Autonomous Region, say countries like Sangay, Gansu, Sichuan, and Yunnan province, where there is a sizable number of Tibetan population. So similarly, 12th 5-year plan, again, it came at the background of Western development goal of China also, in which Tibet was included through special policy support, primarily through, say, for example, minority areas or border area development projects. The 6-year work forum, again, It looked at long-term stability Tibet, basically trying to focus on research and development. That is where I think there are lots of ecological environment also comes into the picture. The recent 7 Tibet Work Forum, I think now there's slight move towards much more aspect of normative institutionalization, wherein now you're trying to look at building within the larger context of Chinese characteristics. After development, I'll just try to move on to the larger China's education strategy or policy in Tibet. Here, I've tried to just try to juxtapose the larger, say for example, controlling through consent. So now like you're not more using force, but rather you're using consent. So I've tried to use this Gramsci's notion of culture hegemony. Of course, again, we have slight divergences, but so why education becomes an important parameter in China's strategy in Tibet is primarily because, say for example, in 1990s, studies showed that there was not much people, say Tibetans, going into the education centers. But say early 2000, now suddenly there was a rise in the sense of Tibetans entering into the institutionalized education system. So that is where it becomes more important, pertinent for China to hold the young minds, especially, so to say. So it is within this, I've tried to use the premise of Gramsci's idea that man is not ruled by force alone, but also by ideas. So here what happens is primarily because the ruling elites uses the combination of ideas, organization, and discursive practices to build and maintain social relations of power. I think that's where yesterday we also talked about the media also, how media, so to say, also enforces that very connotation. Here, through education, what it does is basically tries to portray or popularize the worldview of the ruling class. Here I'm primarily trying to mean the Chinese, Han Chinese worldview, so to say. So when we try to look at the practical practices, of course, when we try to look at theoretically, say China's bilingual education model, it seems to promote both Chinese and the Tibetan language. But when we try to look at its practice, they seems to be completely going into two different directions. Say here we have the prioritization of Chinese language over the Tibetan. So here we have a Model 1 and Model 2. So I think 2024 is the deadline for all schools to move to the Model 2 education, bilingual education model. So concealing contradictions. So here, what I mean by concealing contradiction is, say for example, the shift education policy has been justified by the Chinese on the premise of the larger idea of development. Say for example, premise is that if you learn Chinese language, that is where you are going to get the benefits of development. On modernity, you're going to have a social mobility. And then again, so that is where you try to hide the contradictions. Contradictions of, say for example, trying to make one language superior over the other. So the idea is that, with time, it will lead to the demise of Tibetan intellectual. So I think Gramsci also talks about what you understand in the sense of, say, intellectuals entering the civil society. So here, again, intellectual, by intellectual, I don't mean only the academic scholars, but everyone who is playing that role in shaping the larger society. So primarily the intellectuals here, primarily meaning the Chinese teachers, will be entering the Tibetan schools and then, trying to, I won't say dominate the Tibetan intellectuals. So over the period, and what happens is primarily because the discourses, the narratives of the Tibetans will be done away. Ethnic mingling also, can be understood from that connotation, in the sense wherein, lots of Chinese teachers are brought into the Tibetan schools, and then mixed classes, wherein you have now mixed class in the sense that Tibetans and Chinese students are kept together. So the idea is that even whether you like it or not, you have to the deliberation should be in the Chinese language, so to say. And then boarding school, wherein lots of Tibetan students are primarily put in the boarding school, wherein they are separated from their family. Of course, now the idea is that you don't get the space to interact with your family. So I think that's where Gramsci talks about the generation gap, wherein you don't have seniors or the intellectuals trying to have the discourse being spread over to you. So that is where I think Chen Kuncho and Wu Inchi, the former party secretaries, didn't on targeting young minds, especially the Tibetan young minds. So I'll move on to my, rather say, findings. So the development model which I talked through, say reapproachment policy, it seems to be top-down development strategy. So it was basically a scheme working under a small group of central leaders. And another important finding is that the model development failed to reach the local Tibetan population. So such again, also arises from what we understand, inter-regional inequality in Tibet. So majority of Tibetans, as the graph shows, of course, it's 2017, still I think stands same for now, where majority of the Tibetans stay in the rural areas. But then again, the development model we see are mostly focused on the urban areas. Again, we have ethnic inequality in Tibet is also associated with what we understand as urban-rural inequality phenomena. Again, at the same time, we also see that most, say, non-Tibetan Han and Hui, they are mostly settled in the urban areas, so that is where they get the maximum benefits from the development model in Tibet. Again, these also very interesting in the sense the structures in the development. The development in Tibet has mostly been, say for example, taken benefits by small groups, so to say, who has a better, say for example, relation with the party, who has a better Chinese language fluency, and then of course resources allocation, the capital. Another one is what I understand is the development model in Tibet is highly state-led and the dependence on the central. So that is where I sometimes find a little bit problematic in the sense it is not sustainable. So even when we try to look at poverty alleviation programs, it is highly dependent on the central. So in this, once the center stops funding, that is where again you go back to the, so there is no sustainability in that whole program of development. Again, I've spoken on these also. The Han Chinese teacher in Tibet basically comes within the larger guise of Chinese intellectual, spreading discourse, ideology, and political consciousness of the ruling class at the expense of the ruled class, so to say, here meaning Tibetan classes. So of course, again, the idea of modernity has been used as a pretext to forward the use of Chinese languages. So that is where I hardly see, the larger politics of language, so to say, wherein you create dichotomies, hierarchies, in the sense Chinese language is superior than Tibetans, and it is going to benefit you guys. So in the long run, what happens is basically, it is going to lead to the political conformity of what I understand as Han dominance without using force. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for highlighting different models and forums and the contradiction in development laid by China in Tibet. For the next presentation, may I call upon Somanath Sahoo, research scholar from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. His title for the presentation is Indo-China Border Tension in Tibet Frontier and its Impact on South Asia. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Somanath. So I'll be speaking about Indo-China border tension and its impact on South Asia in general. So in this paper, I will try to explain how the border tension in the Himalayan region between India and China impacts South Asian regions, like how they deal with both the giants have been doing for last couple of decades. So the impact of this border tension on South Asian nations are substantial influencing the strategic environment and diplomatic relations within the region. Smaller neighboring countries such as Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, which is a island nation, has been impacted by both the nations' policies throughout the years. The Indo-China tension lies in the long borderline around 2,100 miles disputed border that is poorly defined. The region's uneven landscape like rivers, lakes, snow-covered packs leads to frequent shifts in boundary lines, bringing soldiers from both sides dangerously close proximity. And China follows a different method to approach border tension, like they apply a salami slicing method. You must be knowing. It means they will come to your region, your border, your area, and they'll put up their temporary tent, and they'll claim this is our land, you go back. And when conflict starts, they will go back little. Again, they'll say this is our land. From there, it's a common border. Like that, they have been doing with India in the border regions. So if you go back to historical aspects, we fought a major war with China. We means India fought a major war with China in 1962. And after that, there have been small skirmishes. In 67 also, there was a hot war, small war, border clash. And then frequent border tension takes place so far. Even during this government, particularly the Modi government period, there have been many border tensions, proximity of the soldiers coming close to each other, and they're fighting in a medieval style, not the modern time like fighting to each other with sticks and clubs. They're fighting with each other and injuring themselves. So China's new border law, which spans 7 chapters and 62 articles, mandates that the placement of boundary markers along its borders to clarify, define its territories. That law not only affects India, but also China's almost 12 to 13 neighbors, which spans more than 22,457 kilometers. The third longest border in the world after with China shares with Mongolia and Russia, which promotes their infrastructure development. Through that article and chapters, they claim that we should secure our border. That's why they're rapidly building their infrastructure in terms of roads, rail line, military post, base, air force stations to secure their border regions. So in the present dynamics, Tibet has been the crucial part of Indo-China border tensions. One of the leading Indian politician and writer, Arun Shourie, says that India's security is closely linked to the existence of and endurance of Tibet as a buffer state. And before China took over Tibet, Tibet was a main buffer zone between India and China, because Tibet was an independent state. So buffer state, as well as preservation of and strengthening of Tibetan culture and religion, is paramount for India because it secures our security in that region. So China's involvement in Tibet represents both danger as well as a strategic opportunity and the presence of Dalai Lama in India and numerous Tibetan refugees across India, they have settled, occasionally enables New Delhi to exert its indirect pressure on Beijing, how China also pressures India using the proxy of Pakistan. So what is the implications for South Asia? The strategic landscape of South Asia cannot be viewed through a single lens, like we assume that all the smaller nations affected by these two giants are taking same policies, foreign policy to deal with this. No, there are different dynamics, like Bhutan and Nepal case is different from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, because Bhutan and Nepal are landlocked. So they have to depend both on India and China in different way. But even Bhutan's case is totally different because Bhutan doesn't deal directly with China. They still don't have any direct diplomatic relations with China because India take care of their foreign policy, foreign relations. So each state's geographic, economic, and political realities shape its approach to navigating the regional power struggle between India and China. One major consideration is the geographical diversity within South Asia. Landlocked countries, as I said, Nepal, Bhutan, face a different strategic concern compared to the coastal nation like Bangladesh and island nation Sri Lanka. Their unique geopolitical environments demand tailored approaches to managing relationship within two giants. Take Nepal and Bhutan for instance. As landlocked countries, they heavily dependent on India for trade and economic support. Their room for maneuver in engaging with China is limited, though both have explored closer ties with Beijing to counterbalance India's dominance. In Bhutan's case, in the year 2017, when India, China, and Chinese soldiers confronted in that tri-junction area, so Bhutan, after all the confrontation, Bhutan said that we didn't ask India to come to our rescue. It was India's decision to come to the confrontation point in that tri-junction area. So somehow Bhutan these days now trying to say that our foreign policy we are trying to explore independently. That's why even they have now dialogue with China. Some delegates, Chinese delegates came, they had dialogue in recent times. So cautious approach is Bhutan is taking cautious approach to its border dispute with China, and its reliance on India's security guarantees further illustrates the complexity of its position, being a landlocked, small, tiny country in that Himalayan region. On the other hand, nations like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka can afford more flexibility in their foreign policies. Bangladesh, for example, has successfully balanced its relations with India while also engaging with China. Though the Belt and Road Initiative investment and infrastructure without falling too deep into China's debt trap. But if you take the example of Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka has been in a debt trap by China. That's why they went through a serious economic crisis 1 or 2 years back, and nobody came to rescue. It was India who donated around $4.5 billion immediately, and also we supplied essential fuel and commodities. But if you look at IMF, on the other hand, they only spent around 2.5 billion, almost half of what India spent. It was not a loan, it was aid. So being an immediate neighbor, giant neighbor, we came to the rescue of Sri Lanka. So, and this is the case of Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh also plays its policy very differently. Then comes to Pakistan. Pakistan, among all the neighboring countries of both India and China, especially South Asia, Pakistan is the only country who is having nuclear weapons. And even there is a conspiracy theory, it is China only who supplied the technology, blueprint, and uranium to Pakistan to get nuclear weapons, to balance India. So the long-standing rivalry with India, coupled with deep military and economic ties with China, it places it in a unique strategic position, unlike other South Asian nations. Pakistan's relationship with China is more of a traditional alignment rather than strategic hedging. So what is hedging? Hedging means it's an economic term. You don't put your all effort in one basket. You have to diversify it. So in IR terms also, hedging means, strategic hedging means, you don't trust a single country. So these small countries, small nations, like apart from Pakistan, they follow this strategic hedging method so that they have good relations with China and India. In international relation, there is no certainty when things will change. So if you totally bandwagon with a particular country, then you might have problem in future. So you have to balance. This is the method, strategic hedging method they follow, particularly small island nations. Even that's the what things follows in terms of US and China also. The other countries also do the same thing. Okay. Then if you come to theoretical things, in the realm of international relations, realists, scholars generally agree that hegemonic powers tend to respond to the emerging challenges through balancing, seeking to counter the rise of new powers by aligning with others or building up their own capabilities. However, there is less consensus when it comes to understanding how smaller or auxiliary states react to these emerging powers. So here, what I understand, of course, United States is a hegemonic power, but China is not a hegemonic power. It's trying to be a hegemonic power because nobody gives consent to China be the hegemon in that region, except North Korea or Pakistan. All the neighboring countries of China, whether it's Japan, Korea, India, Bangladesh, even Russia, now probably the closest ally of China, they don't accept China's hegemony. It's the fault of West, particularly United States. They have pushed Russia to the lap of China. Because of that only, Russia-China ties are closer. So nobody accepts China's hegemony except these one or two countries. But the US is a real hegemon in the region, in the entire world you can say. And China, even what I feel, doesn't have the true blue water navy compared to US. Though they are trying to be, because they are still limited in the 9-dash line in the East China Sea, South China Sea region. They are still stuck there. They can't go beyond that. They are trying to explore, but still US has many bases in Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore. They're encircled by that. So that's what China wants to break, that island chain, 9-dash line. So another theoretician, Stephen Walt, for example, suggests that the weaker the state, the more likely it is to bandwagon rather than balance. According to this view, smaller powers faced with the overwhelming strength of a hegemon or rising power often align with the dominant player in the order to avoid being overwhelmed or isolated. Bandwagoning is seen as a pragmatic strategy for survival, where weaker states seek protection or favor from stronger power rather than attempting to counterbalance them. On the other hand, the structural realist Kenneth Waltz presents an opposing argument to this. He contends that balancing rather than bandwagoning is more universal response. Even among smaller states, in his view, second states, if they are free to choose to flock the weaker side, Walt's theory says that states are more likely to balance against stronger powers to prevent any one nation from achieving unchecked dominance over them. This form of balancing behavior helps them maintain a multipolar system where smaller states align with weaker or opposing forces to ensure their own survival in an international order that remain fluid and competitive all the time, like it's uncertain. So this contrasting theoretical perspective, bandwagoning versus balancing, provide valuable frameworks for understanding the behavior of South Asian states in the context of India-China rivalry. While Walt's theory might explain the inclination of certain smaller states to engage with China in an effort to mitigate India's influence, Walt's perspective helps account for the balancing strategic observation in nations that seek to hedge between the two powers without fully aligning with either. Both theories, however, underscore the inherent uncertainty and strategic calculation that define the foreign policy of smaller states, navigating a complex and shifting geopolitical landscape in the South Asian region. So I want to add one thing, like why China is behaving today like this. Not today, for last couple of decades. There is a saying, whoever is weaker, they tends to become a bully when they grow, whether it's an individual or a nation. So I will draw a parallel between China and one individual. You must have heard of the name of the great I wouldn't say great. I mean, for China, they are great. They are very close. China loves that individual. His name is Henry Kissinger. Okay, so when he was a kid in Germany, okay, he was bullied. So when their parents shifted to US in 1938 or something, so he focused more on studies. He became a professor of political science, then advisor to the United States president. And what he said, he's the person who advised the United States to make China rich. How? To invest more money and invest in China so that China will become a democratic nation. And according to democratic peace theory, democracy, they don't fight with each other. So China will be ally of United States. But instead, it didn't happen like that. China became a so-called monster now. It's trying to capture the lands of everyone, whether it's India. Even Russia also doesn't trust China. Yeah. So that's how China has become. China follows real politics. That's why China loves Henry Kissinger. I think in 1 year, 2 year back, Henry Kissinger gave a visit to China, and he was welcomed like a state guest. Yeah. So you can imagine how much China loves Henry Kissinger because of that common thing. They both. And by the way, Henry Kissinger is a war criminal. During Vietnam War, whatever they did, massacre in Vietnam, but they also bombarded with carpet bombing in Cambodia. And still there are many live bombs, and Cambodians are suffering from that. So that's why these guys, the bullies, love each other. That's my observation. Okay. Then next point is India and China's competing influence in South Asia. Both India and China lay claim to being regional powers, but their approaches and strategies differ significantly. China aspires to solidify its position as the dominant hegemon in Asia, with South Asia being no exception to this ambition. Its economic and strategic interests in the region have depended over the years, driven by initiatives such as Belt and Road Initiative. Conversely, India, with its geographical proximity of influence, as both countries extend their reach into South Asia, the smaller nation in the region, South Asia region, find themselves navigating a complex and evolving power struggle. Economically, South Asia remains one of the least integrated regions globally. International trade among SAARC members is around just 5%. So kind of what I feel, SAARC has failed as a regional economic grouping. Economic development, China sees as a promising partner, this small country, because of its economic prowess. While China offers significant investment and infrastructure projects, particularly through VRI, South Asian nations carefully weigh the risk of deepening dependence totally on Beijing, especially given the concern of debt trap policy, what Sri Lanka has gone through, even many African countries. So in the face of rising India-China tensions, South Asian states have become adept to navigating regional rivalry, and many have adopted wait and watch approach, quietly observing the friction along the Himalayan frontier. And as seen in the ongoing border standoff between India and China, some India's neighbors, with their own grievance, may seek to exploit the future escalation in tension between the two giants, recognizing that their strategic importance has grown now that China is a serious player in the region. Despite China's growing economic footprint, India's enduring structural advantages limit Beijing's influence. India remains one of the largest market in the world, and I'll try to end up. World and deep cultural and historical ties to South Asia, it gives leverage that China cannot easily match. Even as of India's neighbor, except for Bhutan, have joined the BRI. India's position as a regional leader persists, especially in the diplomatic and cultural spheres. Why and how South Asian nations states balance? The shifting Socio-political landscape in the South Asia, coupled with the economic growth of smaller states in the region, has introduced potential destabilizing factors for India. These challenges complicate the balancing acts of smaller South Asian nations as they navigate the competing influence of both India and China. Neither India or China efforts to expand their spheres of influence without the challenges. So in the end, the intricate dynamics of the India-China rivalry reveal a distinct narrative in each South Asian nations, highlighted the complexities of sovereignty, national interest, and regional aspirations. Countries like Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and the Maldives navigate a precarious landscape shaped by their historical ties with India and China different way. Economic dependencies and domestic political contexts, China's investments increase in these smaller states. A power struggle emerges not only between India and China, but also involving external players like the United States, like what recently happened in Bangladesh. Yeah. So this ongoing competition presents both challenges and opportunities for South Asian countries. So how effectively they can cultivate meaningful relationship with these emerging powers while safeguarding their interests remains to be seen. As they strive for economic and development and growth, it is crucial that these nations adopt strategies grounded in a cooperation, mutual benefit, respect, and non-interference. This approach can serve as a counterbalance to the geopolitical pressure they face, enabling them to navigate the complexities of the region more effectively. So that's how I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation on different aspects of Indo-China relationship and the border tension. For the next presentation, I would like to call upon Arnab Mandal, research scholar from West Bengal State University, West Bengal. His title for the presentation today is An Exploration of the Narrative of the Tibetan Armed Resistance Against the Chinese through Kausik Bora's Wind Horse and Jamyang Norbu's Echoes from Forgotten Mountains.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. There is a problem with my throat, so kindly bear with me. So the title of my presentation is The Representation of Tibetan Armed Resistance through certain literary texts. Tibet, a territory situated in the high altitude of the Himalayas, was invaded by the forces of the People's Republic of China in 1950 in order to incorporate it within the fold of the Chinese motherland. As a response against Chinese incursion and subsequent acts of oppression, pockets of resistance cropped up all over Tibet, particularly in its eastern provinces bordering the Chinese nation-state. These groups of fighters, comprising mostly civilians, kept up their resistance against the Chinese occupation of their fatherland till the early years of the 1970s. After coming into political exile in India in 1959, due to increasing Chinese coercion, the Dalai Lama, the spiritual and political head of Tibet, reconstituted the Tibetan government in exile in India in order to safeguard the interests of the Tibetans who followed him into exile, as well as to keep alive the demand of Tibet's autonomy. However, it is often argued that in the official version of Tibetan history, curated by the government in exile, the narratives of the Tibetan armed resistance against the military forces of the PRC have not been duly acknowledged. In her seminal ethnographic work on the Khampa resistance movement, known as the Chushi Gandruk, meaning 4 rivers, 6 ranges, an ancient name for Kham, Carol McGranahan has recognized this unacknowledged past in Tibetan history as arrested history, in the sense of this history of Khampa resistance being postponed and archived for future use. However, very few scholarly works have been done on the literary representations of the Tibetan armed resistance against the Chinese. In order to address this lacuna in the field of Tibet studies, this paper therefore will attempt to critically investigate the construction of the narratives of the Tibetan armed resistance through a detailed reading of the Indian writer Kaushik Borua's novel Windhorse 2013 and the Tibetan writer Jamyang Norbu's non-fictional work Echoes from Forgotten Mountains, Tibet in War and Peace 2023. Now, reflecting on the efflorescence of ethnic conflicts all over the world in the age of globalization, Arjun Appadurai traces the root of ethnocidal violence in the attempts made by the nation states to preserve their supposedly unique national ethnos in the face of increasing global migration. Following Appadurai's observation, it can be posited that a modern state's claim of national sovereignty is often predicated upon the a priori existence of its singular national genius that marks it different from other nations existing outside its territorial borders. However, Appadurai also undermines the idea of the national ethnos being an intrinsic part of the territorial state by shedding light on its construction and subsequent naturalization. According to him, the distinctive national peoplehood is produced and naturalized through, and I quote, rhetorics of war and sacrifice, through punishing disciplines of educational and linguistic uniformity, and through the subordination of myriad local and regional traditions to produce Indians or Frenchmen or Britons or Indonesians. Now, following Appadurai's observation, it can be argued that the deterritorialized Tibetan government in exile has been engaged in the conscious fashioning of the Tibetan nationhood, which could differentiate it from other nation states, particularly China. The Tibetan government in exile has developed a particular version of Tibetanness that seeks to project Tibetans mostly as peaceful, non-violent Buddhists. This version of Tibetanness, it is often argued, aligns with the West's image of Tibet as a land imbued with spirituality and Tibetans as pre-modern, spiritual, passive. Moreover, this version of Tibetanness appears to be in sync with India's political stance towards the Sino-Tibetan relationship. Though India, with its long tradition of hospitality, plays host to the majority of Tibetan refugees, it does not allow the exiled Tibetan community to use its territory for undertaking any direct anti-Chinese program. Over the years, the Dalai Lama's stance regarding the issue of Tibet's freedom seems to have undergone a transformation from the demand of complete freedom of Tibet from the Chinese yoke to the demand of relative autonomy of Tibet within the Chinese nation state. In his 5-point peace plan presented to the US Congress in 1987 and the Strasbourg proposal presented to the members of the European Parliament in 1988, the Dalai Lama proposed the idea of Tibet's relative autonomy within China as a, and I quote, realistic solution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict. He has also proposed the idea of transforming the whole of Tibet into a zone of peace, which shows his preoccupation with the idea of ahimsa or non-violence. Subsequently, the Dalai Lama-led Tibetan government in exile adopted the non-violent middle way approach in order to resolve the issue of Tibet's autonomy in relation to China. However, in the exiled Tibetan community, the official narrative of the non-violent middle way has acquired certain hegemony, thereby pushing to the peripheries alternative narratives, including the narrative of the armed resistance. McGranahan observes, and I quote, while some Tibetans and some histories of Tibet do recognize Tibetan resistance army as part of this history, the standard history of Tibet that circulates both inside and outside of the Tibetan community tends to include the resistance as only a brief, unfortunate, and unsuccessful undertaking. As a result, the Tibetan mirror of history has turned increasingly clouded with time. Now, she places the arrested history of Chushi Gandruk in the category of what Michel Foucault called subjugated knowledge. Certain historical contents or whole set of knowledges are suppressed, she further argues, to control knowledge of the past, to reproduce power structures in the present, and to secure particular futures. However, the postmodern period has witnessed the unearthing of such suppressed narratives. Now, Lyotard, in his The Postmodern Condition, says that the postmodern is age is characterized by the incredulity towards meta-narratives. Postmodernism unmasks the totalitarian nature of the macro-narratives and the power politics underlying their constructions, thereby paving the way for the emergence of the micro-narratives. In the global context, the narrative of the non-violent middle way upheld by the Tibetan government in exile can be regarded as a marginal micro-narrative in relation to the narratives of the nation-states. However, within the Tibetan exile community, the narrative of the middle way has acquired the hegemonic position of a macro-narrative, thereby pushing the micro-narrative of the armed resistance to the margin. Therefore, it can be argued that the narrative of the Tibetan armed resistance against the Chinese inhabits the margin of margin. Now, these gaps in history can be filled up with the help of literary texts which seek to document the lived experiences of people participating in the resistance. Kaushik Borua's first novel, Wind Horse, presents a fictional account of the Tibetan armed resistance against the occupying forces of the PRC. Wind Horse, for which Borua won the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puroskar, is possibly the first Indian novel to shed light on this less explored episode of Tibetan history. As an Indian, Borua does not have a first-hand knowledge of the Tibetan society and the armed resistance, and he looks at them through the perspective of an empathetic outsider. The novel begins in 1947 when the presence of the forces of the PRC was increasingly being felt in Kham, the borderland between central Tibet and China, and juxtaposes the lives of the two characters, Lasang, the son of Dadul, a Khampa merchant growing up at Rioche, a village in Kham, and Norbu, the son of a rich expatriate Tibetan merchant, Karma Shakya, growing up in India. The novel traces the journey of both the characters and shows how they became integrated into the resistance force. However, with the American support drying up and the Dalai Lama urging them to surrender, the resistance disintegrated. With a gun in hand, Norbu ran into darkness towards Tibet, as for him, abandoning the fight for Tibet's freedom meant the loss of the newfound meaning in his life. Many of the resistance members were massacred by the Nepalese soldiers. Lasang and the remaining guerrilla fighters surrendered before the Nepalese soldiers, and they were taken away in chains. And the novel ends with this conviction that, and I quote, "there will be more." Now, Borua's novel revolves around the second phase of the Chushigandruk resistance, which was largely organized outside Tibet and operated from the Mustang base. However, there are occasional references to the first phase of the armed resistance taking place in the latter years of 1950s inside Tibet, particularly in the narratives of one character whose name was Ratu. Ratu recalled the story of his life in pre-communist Tibet, where he used to work under an exploitative landowner who later fought alongside Ratu to resist Chinese oppression. Though Ratu endured a life of misery under his master, he still preferred that life over a life in Chinese bondage, a sentiment also detected by Jamyang Norbu in a number of individuals he interviewed. Ratu's narrative unearths an important aspect of the Chushigandruk resistance force. It included within its fold people from different strata of an extremely heterogeneous Tibetan society. The resistance force portrayed in Borua's novelistic world incorporated Lasang, the son of a Khampa merchant, Ratu, a former bonded field laborer, Sonam, a performer of the Kizar saga, Tenzing, a Lhasa novel, Athar, a monk. So in the theocratic semi-feudal Tibetan society stratified along regional, sectarian, and class lines, such unity was indeed elusive. Moreover, the democratic popular base of the resistance presents it as an alternative to the nobility and clergy-dominated central Tibetan polity in Tibet. Dadul was Lasang's father. Dadul's initial attitude towards the use of force reflects many of the Tibetans' opposition to the violent actions performed by the resistance group, as their violence is not endorsed by the particular version of Buddhism developed in Tibet. However, Borua's novel evinces how the resistance member appropriated the Buddhist religious discourse to legitimize their actions. Looking at the image of a wind horse in a lungta, Lasang became skeptical about the relevance of religion after the Chinese occupation. But Norbu reinterpreted the myth of the wind horse to suggest the continued relevance of religion in altered circumstances. And I quote, "Now it is red for everywhere, red for blood, red for the communists," said Lasang. He has retired now, the wind horse. No, Lasang, not retired, not taking a break either. The methods have changed. Only meditation won't do anymore. Norbu looked at his companions. It is us. We are the wind horse now. We have to carry our people, the three jewels, to freedom. Though the resistance fighters interpreted certain Buddhist ideas in their own way, their devotion to Kundun was unquestionable. They dropped their weapons when the Dalai Lama asked them to surrender. Apart from the religious discourse, the narrative of the resistance as presented in Borua's novel also drew sustenance from the secular tradition of the Geyser saga. Lasang's earliest memory was those of the performance of the Geyser saga by the wandering Drungpas as well as his father. The mythical figure of King Geyser of Ling is regarded as a protector of Tibet. The resistance fighters often invoked Geyser to draw inspiration in their struggle for Tibet's freedom. Lasang's visualization of Geyser proceeding on horseback with raising sword, the surrendered guerrilla warriors, actually transforms them into the fighters of Geyser, which in turn gives their resistance an epical as well as mythical dimension. Just as the Geyser saga is transmitted from one singer to another, which in turn ensures its survival after the death of one singer, the resistance will not end with their surrender. Rather, it will also be taken up in future by other Tibetans. Now, Kaushik Borua's novel shows how the narrative of the Tibetan armed resistance made use of both the Tibetan religious tradition as well as the secular tradition. In spite of his empathetic portrayal of this often ignored episode of Tibetan history, his understanding of the event, it can be argued, remains partial. Borua has presented the narrative of the armed resistance as a homogeneous narrative, which, as the historical records show, is not accurate. He has not portrayed the internal dissension affecting the resistance. Now, Jamyang Norbu, in his part history, part memoir, Echoes from Forgotten Mountain, has presented a more nuanced account of the resistance. As a Tibetan, Jamyang Norbu, who himself was engaged in the resistance movement in Mustang, looks at this episode in Tibetan history from the perspective of an insider. In this book, he has presented a very detailed historical account of the military exploits of many of the Tibetan fighters. However, his position as an insider needs to be interrogated further. He was born in Darjeeling and visited Lhasa once when he was just 4 months old. His construction of the past history was based primarily on stories told to him by others, photographs, the accounts of the past produced both by Tibetan as well as Western writers. Instead of assuming an omniscient voice, Norbu, following the postmodern tradition, draws the reader's attention to the process of writing history as well as his position as a writer. In order to understand the experience of the children of the Holocaust survivors who remain at a temporal and spatial distance from the actual event, Mariana Hirsch developed the concept of post-memory. She attempted to define post-memory as, and I quote, "Post-memory is a powerful form of memory precisely because its connection to its object or source is mediated not through recollection but through an imaginative investment and creation." Jamyang Norbu, who has attempted a mnemonic reconstruction of the past, appears to belong to the generation of post-memory. For him, these inherited memories are not just materials to work upon, rather they develop in him a sense of belonging to Tibet. In her seminal essay, We Refugees, Hannah Arendt marks a small group of Jewish intellectuals that include Heine, Kafka, and Chaplin, among others, who, contrary to the assimilationist tendencies of the majority of Jews in war-torn Europe, resisted this assimilation into a dominant culture. She identified them as the Jewish pariahs who understood that history is not a closed book to them and politics is no longer the privilege of Gentiles. Jamyang Norbu appears to inhabit this pariah position in the exile society because he has repeatedly experienced otherization in the Tibetan society due to his dissident opinions. This pariah position, however, endows him with a critical perspective to question the silences ingrained in the official version of Tibetan history. He has used his personal story as a frame device to narrate the larger history of the Tibetan struggle for independence, thereby becoming in the process an involved chronicler of Tibet's history under Chinese occupation. Now, Norbu focuses on the creation of the Chushi-Gandruk resistance force in Lhasa by a prosperous Khampa merchant named Gonpotashi Andrukstang. In the Lhasa-centric history of Tibet, Norbu argues, the contributions of Chushi-Gandruk are often devalued as the futile last act of Khampa defiance or bloody mindedness. In the Chinese narratives, the resistance fighters are often castigated as mere reactionaries. However, as Norbu argues, it is imperative to understand this pan-Tibetan resistance movement in a more comprehensive way. He draws our attention to the fact that the inclusivity of the resistance allowed the people to join it without the fear of their regional and sectarian identities being subsumed within the larger pan-Tibetan identity. The document on which the initial 43 representatives signed shows that their places of origin or monastery precede their names. Whereas Kaushik Borua presents the resistance fighters as a homogeneous group, Jamyang Norbu has divulged the internal differences afflicting the group, particularly in the second phase. The CIA-trained Tibetan fighters found it difficult to accept the leadership style of Yeshe Khalsang, which resulted in a split in the group. The older fighters, most of them remained loyal to Yeshe, while the CIA-trained young fighters chose Gyalo Thondup as their leader. While Kaushik Borua attempts to explore the conflict between the non-violent principles endorsed by Buddhism and the violent action of the resistance members, Jamyang Norbu's text shows that the resistance fighters did not possibly see them as two opposing poles of a binary. The resistance force was often seen as the defender of faith against the Chinese. Gonpo Tashi and many of his followers obeyed the Shugden oracle. Before undertaking an enterprise, the fighters often requested the Lama to perform a divination. Norbu shows that in Markham, the resistance leaders, after sealing an agreement among themselves, performed a born oath-taking ceremony known as the Red Hide Blood Oath. Norbu witnessed in the Mustang camp, many of the fighters before sunset would walk around the temple and spin the prayer wheels. The resistance, as we have already seen, drew from the secular tradition of the Gizar saga, which was a major source of inspiration. However, Norbu argues that the Gelug-dominated exile administration refuses to accept the importance of the Gizar saga. Norbu has presented two reasons for the marginalization of the Gizar saga. First, members of the Gelug school often considered the Gizar epic as a violent and disruptive distraction to those pursuing religious studies. Second, and this is more religious, Gizar's destruction of the Hor tribe had antagonized Pehar of the Nechung monastery, who previously was the guardian spirit of Hor, and now is regarded as the principal protector of the Dalai Lama and the most important oracular deity consulted by the Tibetan government. Thus, the resistance force combined the Tibetan religious and secular traditions to come up with a narrative that legitimized their actions. Norbu's last act of tying the scarf in the guardrail and praying to unknown gods in America indicate the continuity of resistance in future. It also suggests that America will possibly become the new site from where the resistance against the Chinese occupation will be carried out in future. And to conclude, this alternative version of Tibetan history presented through the narrative of Tibetan armed resistance compels us, the readers, to question the dominant version of Tibetan nationalism that is endorsed by the Tibetan polity, and it enables us to envision other possible forms of nationalism that Tibetans could possibly take in their fight against the Chinese. So thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation on Tibetan armed resistance narrative through 2 different texts. Now the dais is open for Q&A session. Since we are running short of time, we can take only 3 questions for each participant.